This is Dr. Kraus, and for our Old Testament class, I'd like to offer you a little presentation on Hebrew poetry, and hope that this gives you an understanding of how poetry works in the Old Testament. The book of Psalms is our principal example of Hebrew poetry in the Old Testament, and we'll talk more about this when we get to that book. But a psalm is a Hebrew religious poem characterized by a balance of ideas rather than rhyme or words. And usually psalms are designated for accompaniment by stringed instruments. There is no apparent consideration of the number of syllables in Hebrew poetry that you find in the Psalms. Sometimes you find rhyme in the Hebrew text, but that does not seem to be intentional. Some scholars claim that arrangement is according to beat or meter, we might say. So there's a certain beat or rhythm almost to the Psalms, but even that is not really the way that worshipers who are using Hebrew today do it. They don't read it aloud by beats. Instead, they sort of chant it according to a tune, and the tune is sort of the same for all of their poetry. So I don't think that really works either. So the key idea that we want you to look at is the idea of parallelism. And some of you have heard this idea before, but let me just talk about it briefly. Parallelism in poetry is a balance of thought or ideas rather than a rhyme of words. So we tend to think of poetry as having maybe the same length of lines, or maybe rhyming at the end of each line. That's kind of our view of poetry. But in parallelism, it's not so much balancing the sound of the words, it's the ideas behind them. Here's another way of looking at it. One scholar has said that simple parallelism has two lines. Now we'll see sometimes it's more than two lines, but two lines in which one disambiguates the other. So think of ambiguity, or something being ambiguous. It means it's not well defined. So to disambiguate means that the second line helps us understand better the intent of the first line. That's a really helpful way for me to understand it. I don't think it always explains all of the examples of parallelism, but this idea that you have two lines, and you could even say that they disambiguate each other. They sort of work together. So I'd like to look at four main categories of parallelism. I've seen lists of 9 different categories of parallelism. I don't know how helpful that is, but we'll look at 4 that are really quite different, and you'll be able to see how this works a little bit. So the first one, what we call synonymous parallelism, is a repetition of ideas. Let's look at some examples. Psalm 101 says this: "The perverse of heart shall be far from me. I will have nothing to do with what is evil." So here you have 2 lines, but they're really saying the same thing. God is not going to let the perverse of heart, the twisted heart people, the evil people near him. And both lines are really saying the same thing. The perverse of heart, evil people, same thing. Another one, he raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap, Psalm 113. And the mistake that we can make if we're not paying attention to parallelism is we might think, well, this is 2 categories of people. You have the poor and you have the needy, and they're in 2 places. One's over here in the dust and the other one's over here in the ash heap. And in his idea here, it's the same group. It's the poor and the needy are the same group. The dust and the ash heap, basically the same idea, from dirty filthiness. So there's not 2 ideas here, there's only one. So that's synonymous parallelism. Let's look at a second category, antithetical parallelism, which rather than the 2 lines saying the same thing, in antithetical parallelism you will have 2 opposite ideas. So let's see how that works. Psalm 37, the wicked borrow and do not repay, but the righteous give generously. So contrasting these two groups, the wicked and the righteous, the wicked are always taking money and never repaying. The righteous people are giving money in a very generous way. And this sort of idea, the wicked versus the righteous, or in the book of Proverbs, over and over again, it's the wise person as contrasted to the fool, or the fool contrasted to the wise person. So this is antithetical parallelism, talking about the same idea of giving or receiving money, this exchange of money, but two opposite ways of looking at it. Here's another example from Psalm 30. For his anger lasts only a moment, but his favor lasts a long lifetime. So these two qualities of God, his anger or his grace or his favor. Anger temporary, favor forever. And then the second part of this, weeping may stay for the night, but rejoicing comes in the morning. Joy comes in the morning, the old song. So weeping may stay, it just lasts for a while, and then you begin a new time of rejoicing. So antithetical parallelism, couple of examples. One other one here. Psalm 18, you save the humble, but bring low those whose eyes are haughty. So this idea of the humble being down in biblical thought, being way low down, you save them, you lift them up. But those who are very proud, the haughty, you bring them low. So antithetical parallelism, same idea of either raising or lowering in status, and two groups that are treated differently because of their attitude. So let's look at a third type of parallelism. This one's pretty obvious, but where we get the exact expression repeated, we would call that repetitious parallelism. Psalm 27, wait for the Lord, be strong and take heart, and wait for the Lord. So there's kind of a synonymous parallelism here. Waiting and being strong would be equivalent ideas, sort of. Waiting, be strong, and take heart. But then he repeats the same exact wording. Wait for the Lord is repeated twice. There's a lot of power in repetition, by the way. Those of you that are worship students understand this in worship songs, that repetition can be very, very powerful, very uplifting even in certain situations. Another example here from Psalm 67. May the peoples praise you, God. May all the peoples praise you. Then you get another idea in verse 4. May the nations be glad and sing for joy, for you rule the peoples with equity and guide the nations of the earth. So those are all kind of explaining a little bit, but then at verse 5 you get the same wording again. May the peoples praise you, God. May all the peoples praise you. So verse 3 and verse 5 are the same, and you have a related idea in verse 4, but this would be an example of repetitious parallelism. So the last one, and this one really is a little bit controversial. Not everyone agrees with this, but everyone understands there's something going on here. And the term I use for it, it's not original to me, but that has been laid out, is step parallelism. In step parallelism, the second line takes the thought of the first and kind of goes another step. So it's not repetitious, it's not synonymous, but moving the idea along just a little bit further. So let's look at a couple of examples here. Psalm 43, send me your light and your faithful care. Let them lead me. Let them bring me to your holy mountain, to the place where you dwell. So the first idea of being guided by God, send me your light and your care, and by that you lead me, okay? Well, the second idea, let them bring me to your holy mountain. Where are you leading me? You're leading me to the place where you dwell. So you see really lines 3 and 4 in this are kind of synonymous. Let them bring me to your holy mountain, to the place where you dwell. Holy mountain and place where you dwell being the same idea, but notice how you get a progression of thought in these lines. Same idea, but you're just moving ahead a little bit. Psalm 29, the Lord sits enthroned over the flood. The Lord is enthroned as king forever. So the idea of flood here is chaos. The Lord sits enthroned over the chaos. But then he's not just sitting there watching. He is enthroned. He is sitting as king forever. So pushing that idea even a little bit further, I would see that as step parallelism. And like I said, a little bit of a controversial way of looking at it. But what I hope you see here is that if you understand this idea of parallelism in poetry, you'll begin to see it all over the place in the Old Testament. And I want to warn you a little bit, this really is an Old Testament category, and I see students all the time, even my graduate students, who want to find it in the New Testament. I've had them tell me that James uses parallelism. Well, no, he doesn't. This is a Hebrew poetry category. The New Testament's written in Greek. There really is really no parallelism in the New Testament. I think that's a mislabeling of some of the stuff that you find. The Greek poetry works differently. So, but Hebrew poetry, you see this in other related languages from the time of the Hebrew Bible, but we see this, and once we understand it, we can help ourselves not make embarrassing mistakes. And the mistake you can make, by the way, in preaching is you have these two parallel lines that mean the same thing, but you get two different points out of them. Rather than one idea, you get two, and that means you haven't really understood the parallelism. But I want to say that there are other poems in the Old Testament. All of these examples I've given you are from the book of Psalms, but there are a lot of examples of parallelism outside of the book of Psalms, and so I want to look at just a few of these. So the first example we want to look at is from Genesis 49. Genesis 49, long passage here, 2 through 27, where Jacob is giving blessings to his sons. And we're not going to look at all of that, but just a few verses here on the blessing to Judah. So notice verse 10, the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet. Same thing. There's not two deals here. Well, he's got a scepter and a ruler's staff. No, the scepter is the ruler's staff. And going on then, until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nation shall be his. Now that third line there is very difficult in Hebrew, and a lot of people have question about exactly what it means. But the fourth line, if I can say this, disambiguates it. It helps us understand it. So what does it mean, to whom it belongs shall come? Well, it means that you're going to come into your rulership of the obedience of the nations, meaning they'll be obedient to you. Verse 11, he will tether his donkey to a vine, his colt to the choicest branch, not two animals, just one, same animal, two ideas about it. He will wash his garments in wine, his robes in the blood of grapes. And there you begin to understand, he'll wash his garments in wine. Well, why would you do that? Well, the second line there, his robes in the blood of grapes, gives you an idea of what he's talking about. It's not grape juice, it's blood. And so the image of war here, he's going to get all bloody. It's going to look like he's spilled red wine all over himself, but really it's from being in battle. And then his eyes will be darker than wine, his teeth whiter than milk. So kind of almost antithetical parallelism there, describing his countenance, his facial characteristics. He's going to have really dark eyes, but really bright teeth. He's been using that commercial teeth whitener. So anyway, a lot of parallelism there that you see, and as you begin to understand how parallelism works, the text will make more sense to you. Let's look at another example. We mentioned when we were looking at the book of Judges that chapter 4 of Judges is the story of the battle that Deborah, the judge, is in charge of. And then chapter 5 gives that same battle in a poetic form. So it's repeated as poetry. So just one verse here out of this song of Deborah, the poetic version of the battle. Hear this, you kings. Listen, you rulers. Same idea. There's not two groups here. It's not, hey, kings and rulers. No, kings are the rulers. And then the next line, even I, will sing to the Lord. I will praise the Lord, the God of Israel, in song. So there's a couple of things going on here, but the basic one is this synonymous parallelism. I'm going to sing to the Lord, and I'm going to praise the Lord. I'm not going to sing for a while and then praise for a while. My singing is praise. So this parallel idea. Let's look at another example. From Isaiah chapter 13, one of his oracles against the nations and prophecies for other nations besides Israel, you get in chapter 13 his prediction of the fall of Babylon, which, by the way, is kind of picked up in the book of Revelation, some of the themes here, but the fall of Babylon, and the image I've given here is of the banquet described in the book of Daniel, where the hand writes on the wall. We'll get to that when we get to Daniel, but just a couple of verses out of this, verses 2 through 22 in the text, but let's look at just a couple. Wail, for the day of the Lord is near. It will come like destruction from the Almighty. Okay, so the day of the Lord and a day of destruction are the same idea. Now, this maybe could be seen a little bit as step parallelism. The day of the Lord is destruction, and it's going to come from the Lord. But basically the same ideas there in verse 6. Verse 7 is a little bit trickier then. Because of this, all hands will go limp, meaning all the hands, all your strength is going to be gone. And every heart will melt with fear. Those are the same idea. They're going to be terrified. They're going to be powerless. All their strength is going to go away from them. Their hearts are going to sink. Verse 7. And then verse 8 really explains that even more. Terror will seize them. Pain and anguish will grip them. What is the terror going to be like? It's going to be painful even. Those two lines basically say the same thing. They will writhe like a woman in labor. So describing one of the most severe types of pain that everyone in the ancient world would know about. They had all been around women having babies and knew how much that hurt. So this terrible pain that they're going to suffer. And they will look aghast at each other. So kind of the result of that, like a step parallelism, their faces aflame. So quite a bit of parallelism of different types going on in Isaiah 13. And one last one from the book of Job. This famous passage in Job, chapter 38, after Job complaining and griping forever and ever, and finally God answers him. And just a few verses here. This is God asking Job questions. He says, have you journeyed to the springs of the sea or walked in the recesses of the deep? It's the same thing. It's not two places here. Have you been on the bottom of the ocean, is what he's saying. Have you been down there? And then verse 17, have the gates of death been shown to you? Have you seen the gates of the deepest darkness? Again, not two different places. The gates of death and the gates of the deepest darkness are the same thing. So the first line there, gates of death, seem very concrete, but then we realize the gates of deepest darkness, of the darkest things of earth, death and all those things. Do you really understand what's beyond death, is what he's saying here. Have you seen on the other side? And then verse 18, have you comprehended the vast expanses of the earth? Which is sort of a summary of all of that. That's really the step. So have you been at the bottom of the ocean? Have you seen the gates of death? Have you been all over everywhere? Tell me if you know all this. So very pointed question. But you see these parallelisms. And again, you could make the mistake, the springs of the sea and the recesses of the deep, of being a couple different places. I better find those on a map. One's in Texas and one's in Florida. No. Same place, the bottom of the ocean. And that's how parallelism works. Okay, so that's our little presentation on Hebrew poetry, and hope you watch this and take a few notes and be ready for some questions on the quiz.